everyone. My name is Linda Latifaj, and I am a research associate here at A Path for Europe. First, let me extend my hopes that you are all well and staying safe during this pandemic. Second, I would like to take this opportunity personally, as well as in the name of our think tank, to thank all of you for tuning into our webinar. PfEU was founded at the beginning of 2020 as a think tank focusing on the future of the European Union. Our comprise of young researchers, PhD students, master's students, and young professionals. We conduct research, develop policy advice, and want to foster engagement for Europe through debates and talks, as the one here today. This web talk is part of our event series, Coffee Conversations COVID-19, in which we want to explore the impact of COVID-19 on a variety of EU policy issues. In 5 different web talks, experts from Europe and beyond will share their thoughts on current policy challenges and how to navigate them. Now, just a quick reminder for all of you, you can ask questions at any point during this talk. Feel free to use the chat function, and we will make sure to try and answer them towards the end. Also, please make sure that your microphone and your video are turned off to ensure that there are no technical difficulties during this webinar. The COVID-19 pandemic has left no country untouched. Even worse, it has only worsened conditions for an already vulnerable community such as migrants and refugees. While the EU has quickly solidified their resources to combat the pandemic, there is still more to be done for the migrant populations in Europe's neighborhood and beyond. In this web talk, Anna Knoll will explore the EU's migration policy in light of COVID-19 and their response to neighboring and developing countries. Anna Knoll is currently the head of the migration program for the European Center for Development Policy Management, or ECDPM for short. ECDPM is an independent foundation which was established in 1986 to monitor and support development cooperation between the European Union and the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries. Anna, it is my pleasure to welcome you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be part of the first inaugural coffee conversations.
Thank you very much. So to get our discussion started, how about we begin with just how the pandemic has affected migrants in the EU?
Right. I mean, we see quite a diverse picture because migrant communities are quite diverse. Maybe I just run through the most common groups of them. Starting with refugees and maybe also more other vulnerable migrant groups, including irregular migrants without refugee status or asylum seekers. They're just still awaiting or pending a decision. They're obviously, I think, as with most vulnerable groups in Europe, they have been very gravely affected by the pandemic as well. One, because some of them live in camps, and we've seen all the news of the situation already in, let's say, the Greek refugee camps, but also communities in Italy, where we've had issues of access to services for some time, and for sure the pandemic has exacerbated these risks. Not only with the fear of the possible virus spreading, and then it's very difficult to enforce some of the recommendations, social distancing, but also because it has made it more difficult to access certain services, simply because one, the political attention has shifted, and second, with the measures in place and the lockdowns, there was less support and also less access of humanitarian agencies, and they had to quickly reorganize to comply with some of the provisions of distancing. That for sure has exacerbated the situation, all in a context where we still have no clarity in Europe about political solutions to the whole issue of refugee protection. Then again, that has existed before the pandemic, but for sure the situation doesn't not help now. And we've, we can talk about it a little bit later when we talk about Africa. But we still have the situation now where people take boats coming over the Mediterranean, and with the pandemic, Italy and Malta have declared their port unsafe, also with a view of not being able to have a proper response. people are even more stuck or more in limbo than they were before already. Then we have we have the larger sort of migrant communities are legally working migrants in Europe. And I think here we have seen that how essential migrant workers are for one, critical sectors. We've seen the debates on agriculture, on healthcare systems specifically. In a lot of European countries, migrant workers are overrepresented in the healthcare and sort of both in terms of doctors, nurses, but also the home care sector. With the sort of lockdown, but also the restrictions to travel in place, that has just meant that some people have left back home and others have not been able to come to the destination. So that actually led to critical shortages, and countries were very quick to see how they can actually get critical migrant workers in, so shipping around the existing. So yeah, that has happened. We've also seen, interestingly, very quick responses in terms of advancing policy debates that have happened for a long time. I mean, one of these debates is, for example, the recognition of qualifications. And here again, with the critical shortage in some sectors, there was a question whether this cannot be sped up. So it has actually accelerated some of these debates. And then secondly, migrant workers are also in sectors, relatively, the share of migrant workers in some of the sectors most affected by the crisis negatively, such as the tourism sector, restaurants, cafe, bars. There you have also a high share of migrant workers working in these sectors that have then disproportionately also lost from the crisis. And also, in some EU countries, they are covered by social security, but because of the migrant status, they may also actually fall through some of the cracks and not get the support that nationals would get. So there's a possible exacerbation of vulnerabilities there. I think that's maybe to sum up some of the biggest group of migrants we have in Europe.
Yes, of course. That definitely. Thank you so much for that very quick synopsis, because they're a very large and very vulnerable group that can actually fill so many different areas of life, from refugees to labor migrants to skilled laborers that, as you mentioned, now on the positive end, I guess it could be somewhat positive, their qualifications are being recognized because we are in a time of need, and that has been accelerated, as you mentioned, which is great. But then you have obviously the negative side effect of their conditions in refugee camps, or their lack of healthcare, their lack of having an actual government to represent them, to protect them, especially during this time. I would like to go back to how you mentioned Africa earlier, because I know that your organization works more closely with the African continent. If you could tell us more about just how this pandemic has not only affected them, but also affected EU relations with African migrants.
Maybe before, I will also just highlight the situation of African migrants within Africa, because here for sure the situation is not different. A lot of the African countries have also put in place travel restrictions, border closures, lockdowns. Mm-hmm. There's strong flows of South-South migration within Africa, and migrants fill a lot of also shortage of workers in sectors in African economies. And obviously it has affected them, and what is maybe even more crucially so, we know that essential for a lot of families that rely on them for their access to health, access to education, food. And this, we've seen a massive reduction of remittances flows. And that is also interesting, because usually remittances flows when there is a crisis. And we've seen it, for example, in other previous economic and also financial crises in the past. Remittances are usually a cushioning effect. So they're sometimes counter-cyclical. When there's crisis, people send more remittances to cushion. This time we don't see that, obviously, because it affects almost the whole world, and because of the economic lockdowns, it's sort of everyone loses and remittances go down. So it's not only the migrants that are affected, but a lot of the families and people back home. So I think that's grave, and that will stay with African countries for some time. And I think here it also requires sort of where international cooperation with international partners, and including the EU, will have to adjust. Some of my colleagues just brought out a paper on this, if people are interested to read further. In terms of, maybe if we go to the situation of refugees in Libya, and the whole situation that I mentioned has exacerbated with COVID-19. So I think what has happened is that we've seen before, also including in North African countries, for instance, so Algeria, also Egypt to some extent, and in Libya have been sort of exacerbated, and governments actually even engage now in harder crackdowns on migrant communities. So we had a couple of cases in the last month where African governments and border officials have, for example, cleared detention centers, asking migrants to leave, sometimes expulsing them or deporting them across the border to the neighboring country, for example, Algeria to Nigeria. And then again, that's been practices we've seen before, but they seem to have been much more frequent, also with the rationale to possibly not have overcrowded camps. But one never knows quite what the exact rationale is, whether it's sort of like it's just a political use of a crisis, or whether there's real concerns for. So that we've also seen that in Libya, and then in combination with the European border closure, as I mentioned, has made it really difficult for migrants to move around, also given the lockdown. So what this means is they're more vulnerable. Some of them have abandoned plans they may have had to travel further and are stuck, given that they cannot leave or cannot ship around certain border closures. Others have to pay a lot more, have to bribe a lot more, and still take the risk. So the routes have become more risky. And we still see people leaving. I mean, I think, was it this morning, I just heard again that another boat has left Tunisian shore this time. And they're even more in limbo because they have to basically rely on more commercial ships, because Libya has not engaged in much search and rescue, neither has the EU. So they have to basically, they're more vulnerable, and there's surely probably more people also perishing at sea or in the Sahara Desert right now. And we have the ongoing sort of discussion about solidarity in Europe, which is a never-ending story and has not been resolved. So I think that's sort of, I think that partly answers your question, maybe on relations. But
no, of course, it's as we mentioned before, this is such a wide topic, and especially given this pandemic, it has encompassed so many aspects of just everyday life, and especially for migrants, as you mentioned, their remittances, their lack of employment, their lack of economic opportunities, and just the sheer fact that so many people who are still trying to leave. I believe I recently read that in Libya, they have closed off their ports completely due to increased shelling nationally, locally. So now anyone who's trying to port anywhere, as well as with Italy and Malta, as you mentioned, they're stuck in a no man's land, for lack of a better term. Based off of that, can you help explain any, I guess, responses that the EU has done thus far, or have they been insufficient in your opinion?
I mean, I think in Malta, government has sent a letter some weeks ago to the EU Commission and other member states to do more and help Libya more in this situation. Obviously, also with the fear that they are one of the first countries that would usually, have boats arriving and have disembarkation of migrants. And they felt now that the political attention is maybe shifting away from the Libya context because there's so many issues to deal with within Europe. They felt that needs addressing, and I think that the EU Council has made a decision that there will be, again, more support, both humanitarian, but also, supporting the border guard as the EU and member states have done in the past to deal with this situation. There is sort of discussion. The EU has led a donor pledging conference for global response to the pandemic, which helps all countries, but the EU has pointed out that migrant communities and refugees are an important group to benefit. I think there's a lot of work going on to redirect some of the programming and humanitarian response that the EU has supported before to deal with COVID. But when it comes to, there have been, for example, calls, including by the European Parliament or by some parliamentarians, to do more in the refugee camps in Europe itself. Let's say Greece, for example, and I think there, as I said before, the situations have deteriorated, and there it sort of brings up the question again why we have people confined to this situation in the first place and how we deal with it. So in my view, it's not the political priority of EU member states right now, given all the other sort of responses that are being organized for COVID. So I think here obviously more could be done, but it seems sort of a shortage of time and efforts everywhere to deal with the situation. So I wonder a bit what of how it affects. We have for some time now there's discussion on this new European Migration Pact, and the external dimension on migration. So the how to support or how to cooperate and deal with neighboring countries, African countries, and global response to migration. I think the EU member states have reached a consensus already a while ago, but it's always stuck with the internal sort of question about asylum system of the EU and specifically responsibility sharing. And I think that has possibly made it even more complicated, the situation that we have now. So I think there's we've had a delay already. This pact is meant to come out. There's the question of solidarity, and I think now with ports being closed and sort of the game of who takes refugees is still on the table. I don't think it makes it easier, but for sure, if we had a very well-functioning system, we could also help migrants or refugees in the vulnerable situations more. So obviously, I think here the EU could have done more if it politically agreed to an approach, which unfortunately it seems very far away.
Yes, of course. In an article that I recently read that you co-authored, you called this the crisis that displaced the other, which I could not have put it more poignantly myself, because the migrant crisis has been an ongoing crisis for time going on, and the way that they have been affected now due to this pandemic and everything just shutting down economically and politically, with border closures and economic layoffs, it's making a already difficult situation even more difficult. As you mentioned, it was supposed to have been, I guess, ratified and signed last month, from what I recalled, but it's still, I believe countries are still calling for it to be signed and to be gathered upon. Could you elaborate just a little bit more on just what exactly their pact would entail, or what thus far is known about the pact?
So the pact is basically, with the new commission coming in, there's always then sort of an attempt to try to see where things stand and to pool and get momentum. So essentially the pact was looking at not necessarily suggesting completely new policies, but trying to resolve those issues and getting new momentum on those that haven't been agreed. And as I said before, on the external dimension, there's already been, policy frameworks for the last years, and there's a lot of money the EU now puts behind, or aims to put behind, in the negotiations of the new financial framework on supporting partner countries to deal with migration externally, and then doing that through different ways. So that is again included in the pact, and I think that was less controversial. And also on the internal side, it was basically building already on existing proposals that were on the table of how to basically reform the common European asylum system. The big question here is about who takes how many migrants, which is, you can say, sort of as responsibility sharing discussion, or some call it burden sharing. That has never been resolved, and there's been several sort of proposals on the table, and one of them, which is now resurfacing to break the deadlock that exists in discussions, is to have a sort of diversified system of how countries could share or how they could show a responsibility, not only through taking a certain amount of refugees that would, for example, be determined by a key, similar to what Germany is doing across its lenders, but for example, to financially compensate, or pay more into a certain fund, and that is to basically get on board some of the Eastern European member states that have not been willing to accept a sort of compulsory system where each country would be assigned a certain number of refugees to host. I think that's been the essential discussion. There's some other EU member states which also don't really accept a sort of alternative way of showing solidarity, feeling that the EU is a community where you share the values, and refugee protection is one of the key ones. So a country could not necessarily say by paying more financially to get away from that responsibility. So I think that's been the main issue. And we will see now if there's some sort of common notion that countries can agree on, because then the pact may actually be quite quickly. The question then still is whether it's new things. To me, I mean, I have not sort of really analyzed the draft, but it seems more that it's a pooling of existing practices and getting new momentum. And now they also have to adapt it to the post-COVID time, where you will have continued lockdowns, continued sort of restrictions, maybe on travel, on mobility, all over the world. So that will for sure also affect some of the things in practice.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for that answer. I just want to take this time to remind everybody who's watching that you are more than welcome to use our chat function to ask any questions, and we will get to them accordingly as we continue on. Now, Anna, I actually want to go back to what you mentioned before, especially about how migrants now who are left in kind of this quote unquote limbo, they have to change their plans. They have to end up spending more money in an already economically poor situation. Has this, now I don't know if you can comment on this or not, but has this led to an increase in either organized crime or human trafficking or anything along that aspect, which tends to correlate with crises and following the other? If you can comment on that.
Yeah, I haven't actually read up a lot on it, but there's a really good research done by the Transnational Center on Organized Crime. And they've been looking at how quickly, as you say, transnational organized crime has adapted. And for sure, there's some, I think it differs. There's some, I mean, migration routes are still taking place, and then some people have changed their plans, and those that can afford it, they may have to pay more, possibly for riskier routes to ship around some of the restrictions, or they have to pay border guards more bribes to be able to get around. But I'm not quite sure really. I mean, initially, what was interesting, we've seen actually towards Europe, we've seen less departures very early in the breakdown when the European Union has put in place a lot of the lockdowns. But I think that has changed again now. So it seems that irregular migration, and that is also partly organized by transnational networks engaged in criminal activity, they still seem to operate. I think they're just adapting to the situation and see how they can still make money and get around certain restrictions, and especially in places where corruption is high. You see, people capitalizing also on their situation and the power they have.
Yes,
by making things possible, but maybe demanding more money or more bribes.
of course. Okay, and before we get over to the questions that we have from our audience, I would like to also, if you can, touch on now the implications for EU migration policy and the political landscape. I guess the long haul looking forward, how has this changed? And more importantly, because EU and Turkey have had a migration deal in place. However, that now caught up in this crisis, is that still continuing on, or what can we see for future migration policies? Sorry if that's a very long-winded question.
Right. On the long haul, I think it's very difficult to see, but we see two trends. One is more worrying and one maybe a slightly more positive one. On the more worrying one, we've seen groups that perceive migration negatively and politically exploited and play on populist sentiment, also using this opportunity to enforce policies that they may have politically held before. And we see that actually across the world. So that's just exacerbating a trend, whether it's Trump banning all immigration for the next 2-3 months, and who knows, whether that is just sort of the COVID crisis is seen as a good opportunity to continue doing that. Similarly, in some African countries, you've seen such measures. Then and that may well continue, even though obviously migrants did not necessarily contribute to this. What is true that mobility and connection makes such a virus spread very fast, and I think that's what people can probably that want to exploit the situation politically. They can both use sort of the argument of mobility being a threat, not only in terms of security or terrorism, but also health-wise. Secondly, they can, because we have huge economic impact everywhere, so then the narrative of our own workers first may likely come back, which you could be used to justify. But the more positive one, as I said before in my introduction, that we've seen how strongly also, for example, our European economies depend on migrant workers. And I think all families feel that, whether it's the grandparents that don't get access to certain care because workers are missing, whether it's agricultural businesses that rely on agricultural workers that are predominantly migrant workers. And all these questions, I think we can, and there's actually quite a good number of initiatives how to also support these migrant workers right now and also in the future. I think that we can capitalize on and make sure that it doesn't sort of fall back into a very nationalistic logic where all countries close each other off. I think that can be used to be just more smart about migration, about mobility. In the long run, I do probably it will be a mix of both. So for sure, for the next years, I would say we would see more restrictions to not only travel, but also to migrants, because maybe also with countries and governments, but also people themselves, I think, will be more cautious. And then hopefully what we'll see is a smart adaptation to just have more, screening or health screening, but to not have sort of crackdown or hampering on the travel mobility aspect. I think that's sort of in terms of long term. I'm not sure about whether really the pact with Turkey will be. I mean, everything right now has been a bit in suspension mode because things have changed so quickly. I think that the EU will still hold on to its policy to trying to negotiate cooperation and deals with third countries in its neighborhood, also in the future. And I think the pressure of irregular migration may also not subside, as it doesn't now, and it's not likely it will do so in the future. So I think I'm not even sure we would see much of a change, other than possibly even stronger push to do so. As I said, given that maybe also European governments fall back into more the logic of seeing migrants as a threat, even more so than what was already the case before.
No, of course. It's definitely going to be a very long haul and a long challenge as we continue on, especially for these very vulnerable communities. Now, I would like to get into a few of the questions that we have been having. First, one of our questions is, will the ways we have been dealing with this pandemic change the migration policies in future? We just answered that. I guess that, as you mentioned, everything is in suspension, so we will just have to wait and see how things grow out of this. But the positive note is definitely the aspect that people are realizing more and more, countries are realizing more and more that migrants are very valuable parts of their community and of their economies and of their environments. So hopefully that positivity continues as we move on.
And there's been policy approaches, for example, on recognition of skills, on portability of social security, that have actually, there's been more calls for pragmatic solutions to support critical and key migrant workers in European countries. And I think that can be something also that can stay for the longer term.
Yes, of course. Hopefully, we can only hope, especially with the expediting of any of them who have special certificates or special skills or are higher skilled in different areas. Those are skills that in this day and age, and especially during this crisis, should be used to their best abilities. They should be able to use those despite their quote unquote legal status within those borders that they're in.
But it's interesting that it takes this crisis to reveal that, right? So it's sort of things that I think people working on migration have been known or calling for some time, but that just made it now so critical that because everyone was looking for more pragmatic solutions, that I think it has pushed some of these policy agendas.
No, of course. It's, as you mentioned, it's terrible that it took this for people to realize that, but hopefully it's not something that is forgotten once the crisis is over. Now, one of our questions actually also asks, what do you think of Sweden's unusual approach to fighting the pandemic? So I don't know if you can answer on this one, but I feel like it's been lately Sweden has been kind of in the spotlight in one way or another due to the way that they have reacted, in the sense that they haven't reacted as strongly as other countries. If you can voice your opinion on that one.
Yes, I mean, I've seen it a bit, and I have colleagues that actually went to Sweden when we had closed our office. We were allowed to work from wherever. So, and they went to bars and went out way longer than, for example, when we in Germany already had a lockdown. So it's definitely different, but I think now they've also adjusted a bit. And maybe it is sort of a cultural thing also. It seemed to work that maybe people are a bit more reasonable in Sweden. At the same time, I feel they have had, I think, strong increase in cases, which made them also reevaluate a bit their policies. I don't know. I'm not a specialist on pandemics or health issues, so I'm not quite sure whether really my opinion counts about whether Sweden has had a good approach or not. I think probably time will tell.
Only time will tell. You are correct. No, that's. I wanted to see our questions that our viewers are adding in. Okay, let's move on. So we have one question that asks, so what can we do to not have the public mood turn against refugees and migrants? When it comes to skilled migrants, I'm sure the discussion would not be so negative, but more vulnerable refugees, especially minors. How could we protect them in the years to come and contribute to a compassionate public response?
I think, one thing is on the skilled migrants. I think that is an interesting debate itself, because we always talk about skilled and then we talk about low skilled, but we don't really necessarily have a good distinction what that means. I mean, agricultural workers on the fields, are they low skilled? Are they, we realized that these are critical workers that support our economies, and if they're not there, many European countries from Spain over to Germany have a real issue. So I think that's even one thing we can highlight, is that it's this whole distinction about skilled, non-skilled may be false. It's a lot about contribution of migrants in very many different sectors that we probably can highlight that they should be appreciated because they fulfill important functions. So it may, help in that the distinction is less means less negative views on these sort of so-called lower skilled, and then talking about the vulnerable situation. I think coming back to what we've said before, whether the EU could have done more. I mean, there's been some EU member states taking minors from Greek camps, but there were really few. I think the solidarity was, I think, in the numbers of 15 here, 10 there. Whether it shows a little bit of solidarity, whether it helps really the issue, I don't know. I mean, here it's a really difficult question what we can do as a society, other than constantly highlighting that European values are built also on solidarity and leaving no one behind, and that these vulnerable groups, should not be forgotten, which they currently seem to be. I mean, situations are as worse as in some of camps in African places I've seen, so that is not much of a difference in Europe. But I think it's basically showing that this affects everyone, and the fact that migrants contribute so much and can also contribute. Again, the discussion here was, for example, in Germany, whether then refugees and asylum seekers should not be allowed to work to fill some of the functions. That shows that it's all very political, because if there's a crisis and then you suddenly realize, oh, they actually can help and they can help our economy, they can probably also do that when there's not a crisis situation, because they do have certain skills, they do maybe have education. It's just a question whether you recognize it or not and you allow them. I think that we can highlight, and then we can hope that it makes a contribution to not falling into this sort of more nationalistic or populist thinking about migration, which is also there, and which will maybe exacerbate, because economically all countries may do worse in the coming years.
Oh, of course, and it's just as you mentioned with that very interesting dichotomy between skilled and unskilled. It's a very hard measure. It's hard to measure what is a skilled worker, what is an unskilled worker, and in this, especially during this crisis, they should be not only appreciated but given the opportunity to contribute. I'm sure that, I can't speak for all migrants, but I'm sure that if they were given the actual opportunity to contribute, they would. That would be a welcoming aspect for them to be able to do that. Now I'd like to move on to a few more questions. We have one that says, thousands of vulnerable people seeking international protection, including a high percentage of children and UACs, are facing the policy implications of EU-Turkey deal in the Greek islands, living in inhuman conditions, especially during the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. Only small numbers were relocated to the mainland, and a small number of UACs were for now relocated to other EU countries. Will the EU consider relocation to scheme as an urgent humanitarian response?
Sorry, can you repeat whether the EU will?
Sorry, let me reread that. Will the EU consider relocation to scheme as a urgent humanitarian response? As you mentioned, they've done their relocation scheme for minors. If there would be anything more, and if that scheme, I guess, goes broader than just Europe and Europe's.
Right now, as a COVID response, we don't see that, because if that was a priority, we would have already seen a relocation from some of the overcrowded camps away, but we've only seen it for the minors. Again, that discussion comes back to the broader EU system, which is being discussed in that pact, and where there's been no political solution and agreement on how to negotiate that. everything has stopped. Resettlement has stopped. Relocation has stopped. Dublin II transfers have been stopped because border restrictions have been put in place. So I think that will come with the pact, and if there is a solution, whatever it will look like, whether we have divergence in or a diversity of ways of showing responsibility, that may happen, and then maybe if the restrictions are lifted, we go back to the system. Right now, I don't see it as an emergency response. What we see rather is, even some countries have also stopped asylum processing or access to filing cases for asylum because of many people working from home, not working, social distancing, and I think that has also meant that there's less relocation and less resettlement overall as part of the emergency response, for sure, which made it more difficult for these infected migrants.
Of course. Now, I actually have been going over our discussion in my head as you've been speaking, and would like to actually ask just one question about the effect, because you mentioned how this has affected not only African migrants who are migrants abroad, but also African migrants within Africa. But has this pandemic or this crisis changed their perception of, I guess, expatriates or outside workers who have been working in Africa, either from the Europeans who work in Africa or the Chinese who work in Africa? Have you seen that exploitation of the external workers?
You mean how Africans sort of perceive European migrants in Africa?
Yes.
Or?
How they perceive?
Well, I think, yeah. There's been some cases, some reported cases of racism and some responses, maybe based on fear of also European and Chinese migrants in African countries bringing in the virus, which may not be so untrue. I think the first cases in many African countries were Europeans or I think in one case Chinese that came in and that had it, at least the first recorded ones, and then that just sort of spreads, and it becomes also but not only in Africa, I also know in India, it's foreigners are not very well perceived in certain local communities because yes, it's perceived as an outside threat that brings in possible diseases, and it's the same image, that we've seen in Europe of people saying that migrants from Africa bring in certain diseases, and it's even been used here in Italy. I think there have been some cases where Europeans and Chinese were attacked, I think in Ethiopia and in Kenya, but maybe these are sort of incidences that exist, but I'm not sure to what extent they really represent the societal dynamic. I was even in Senegal in March still. That was my last travel. And then by then Senegal didn't have many cases, and it's now been actually quite strongly affected compared to other African countries. But I did not think that there was some sort of emerging animosity towards Europeans suddenly developing because of it. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. And I think we might have time for one more question. In which way will COVID-19, or in which way can COVID-19 affect the negotiation of the next cooperation framework between Europe and Africa, focusing on migration policies?
Right. So we have
right.
there's a summit coming up in we'll see if it happens, but it was planned for this autumn between EU and Africa or African Union. I think two things. One is it will shift some of the topics to deal with the corona response and how to deal with the economic or socioeconomic impact of it, and how to plan for the future, taking maybe precedence over some other topics that would have been there before. But that we have to see. I mean, I think as with everything, a lot of the rethinking is now happening in terms of what does the current situation now mean for specific sectors. that will take place. And then the question is also a more geopolitical one. I think we've seen a trend that was there before in terms of geopolitics becoming stronger and competition at a global stage between countries like the US, like China, like the EU becoming stronger even with the COVID. And there seems to be something similar also in the relation with Africa, where the EU has said, even before COVID, Africa is an important partner for us for the future. We need to put in way more efforts. Now, sort of one of the reasons brought forward why, for example, there's a push to still have the joint summit in autumn and not push it, is to signal to Africa that EU is really putting a strong importance to that partnership, and that other actors like China or others do not come in between and organize big sort of summits and show solidarity. So I think there's this element to it. And then, yes, in all the themes, I mean, even also on migration, some things will have changed, and some of the policy priorities of countries will have changed, which then affect some of the more thematic discussions on cooperation. But for sure, I think there'll be a big question how the Western world supports those countries that may, be hit a bit later, where we statistically don't even know the impact of the virus. How, the world shows solidarity with some of the poorer countries that are going to be hit hard, we already know, and that have less resources to deal with it themselves.
Of course. Yeah, hopefully we can only hope that as we come out of this, everything changes for the better in every aspect, but especially for the most vulnerable communities and for the migrant communities. Anna Knoll, I would just like to thank you so much on behalf of myself and our think tank for sharing your expertise and your knowledge on such a vast topic. I believe we can discuss this for hours on end, but thank you so much for joining us today.
That's true. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. And to all of our viewers, thank you all for joining us today. For more information, go to pathforeurope.eu and also check out Anna Knoll at ECDPM. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.